May 1945 arrived like a struck bell across the cold waters of the Atlantic. On May 8th, V-Day, Europe celebrated the formal end of the fighting on the continent. But beyond the headlines, beyond the jubilant crowds in London and the quiet streets of bombed-out German cities, an enormous armada of steel was still cleaving the waves: the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet. Hundreds of men in tight, rain-slicked uniforms watched the horizon from conning towers. Beneath them, muffled and metallic, the living guts of a closing empire breathed and waited. The order that ended their patrols was simple and devastating. Senior German Naval Command, under the shadow of collapse, instructed every remaining U-boat to cease offensive operations, surface where safe, hoist a white flag, and head to the designated Allied-controlled ports. For crews who had stalked convoys in black nights for years, who had learned to trust only the cramped, gasoline-scented hush of their boats, the signal to surface felt like the final act of an impossible play. Engines that had threaded depths and storms were throttled. Periscopes rose for the last time. Around them, the sea that had been theater, ally, and graveyard became a corridor to an uncertain future. Scatterings of surrendered submarines made for a surreal picture across the northern seas. Inlets and fjords, places that once hid German boats from aerial reconnaissance, now played host to lines of gray hulks. Loch Ewe in Scotland, Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, Portsmouth and Portland on the English south coast, and harbors in Norway filled with U-boats of every class. Their crews, exhausted and wary, walked out into daylight that no longer belonged to them. Naval police, intelligence officers, and technicians boarded them, taking inventory in a meticulous, shamefaced ritual. Tonnage, armament, torpedoes, codebooks, radio equipment. Men who had fought and fled were now catalogued and questioned. The hush of defeat had a bureaucratic echo. What greeted Allied inspectors was a mixed anatomy of the submarine war. Some boats were nearly immaculate, maintained by crews who had been proud of their machines until the end. Others were wrecked by months at sea without adequate maintenance, ravaged by depth-charge scars, torpedo damage, or sabotage. Some engines would not turn, advance mechanisms seized by rust and neglect. Many boats were crawling with fatigue. Cracked rivets, salt-eaten steel, frayed electrical cabling, the physical proof of a long, violent campaign. The logistics of containing those surrendered vessels were staggering. The Allies had to assemble crews to guard, fuel, and provision these subs for the final ride to port. Naval boarding parties removed classified material, codebooks, enigma rotors, signal charts, safely stowing them away for intelligence exploitation. Engineers and salvage teams rummaged through compartments, cataloging weaponry and technology that would be studied for years. The scene at the ports was something between a war cemetery and a salvage yard. Rows of conning towers like bowed heads, glinting periscopes, and weathered hulls, each with its human story inside. Not all submarines would make the intended journey. Some were taken under tow and began the long, vulnerable transit to collection points. Others began to fail at sea. Mechanical failures, storm damage, and the simple exhaustion of men and machines meant that many did not reach the safe harbors. Where a crew could not repair their boat, it would be left. Where a tow parted in rough weather, steel would be lost to the deep. The Allies recorded those losses with the sober detachment of men who had seen too many ships vanish. Still, the majority limped into ports, where they were met by waiting teams ready to secure and process them. This first phase of surrender revealed as much about the human condition as it did about technology. A German petty officer might climb up from the boat's engine room, hands shaking from cold and coffee, to find a young Allied lieutenant waiting with a clipboard. They could share a cigarette under a gray sky, they might not. There were moments of mutual recognition, professional respect between sailors who knew the sea's rules, but also the raw edge of retribution and humiliation. For many crews, the end of the war was not a clear-cut relief. It was ambiguous, messy, and profoundly human. Where? These surrendered boats ended up varied by geography, by opportunity, and by the strategic interests of the victors. Some remained in British-controlled ports. Others were interned in ports around Norway and Scotland beyond the immediate reach of Soviet claims. The condition of many submarines was such that simply keeping them afloat took expertise, pumping, emergency repairs, and constant maintenance. Allied engineers who walked those decks took notes. This hull had a new kind of battery arrangement. That conning tower held a novel periscope geometry. Details that would matter as Allied navies and intelligence organizations plotted out post-war priorities. In the weeks following the surrender, the immediate work fell into two categories: securing the surrendered boats and determining their fates. That would set the stage for an extraordinary, often unseen, chapter of the war's end. A multinational debate over whether to preserve, to study, or to destroy the instruments of a dying naval menace. The image of U-boats, once the terror of convoys, now lined up at peaceful anchorages, became a potent visual metaphor. These were weapons stripped of violence, hulks waiting for judgment. The seas that had swallowed sailors and steel were now full of history washed ashore. For the people of northern ports who saw these lines of submarines, the sight was a daily reminder of the colossal technological duel that had been fought beneath the waves. And of what would come next, the unraveling and redistribution of that technology in the cold calculus of a world sliding toward a new and uncertain order. With the submarines secured and crews disarmed, Allied leaders confronted a thorny problem: what to do with the largest undersea fleet the world had ever known. The answer had to balance immediate safety, long-term strategic implications, and raw national interest. The question was not only military, but political. Who would take custody of these boats, who would dissect their secrets, and who would ensure that the weapons of a fallen regime would not seed future conflict? On one side were the pragmatic safety arguments. Leaving dozens of war-worn warships in the water indefinitely was impractical. They required constant maintenance to prevent pollution, they presented hazards for navigation, and many were structurally unsound. Months at sea, battle damage and sabotage left them unstable. Simply storing them in port was a recipe for disaster: rusting hulks, leaking fuels, and the logistical drain of maintaining enemy craft without a clear plan. On the other side were scientific and strategic incentives. The German Type X-21 Elektrobos, with its radical hull design and improved submerged speed and endurance, represented a potential leap in submarine technology. Engineers and naval architects in Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union eyed these designs with a combination of respect and alarm. The prospect of reverse engineering German advances to improve Allied designs was too valuable to ignore. A small number of boats, particularly those in good condition or representing advanced technological concepts, were obvious candidates for preservation and intensive study. So, the Allies sat down and divided responsibilities. A tripartite committee, representing Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, was tasked with distributing the more useful vessels among the victors for inspection, testing, and trial. These allocations were both scientific and political. Each power wanted a slice of German ingenuity, and each wanted to deny that knowledge to the others. The result was a pragmatic split. Some submarines were set aside for detailed examination and trial, while many more faced disposal. Dispersion of responsibility eventually produced Operation Deadlight, the codename for the mass scuttling of German U-boats. It was a decision made out of both necessity and strategy. Keeping the large majority of captured submarines afloat or in reserve was not only expensive but strategically risky. The Allies did not need hundreds of enemy hulks either rotting in foreign ports or becoming the seeds of future rearmament. Providence, weather, and bureaucratic will converged on destruction as the most feasible large-scale solution. Operation Deadlight began in late 1945 and stretched into early 1946. The plan was logistically straightforward. Macro level, gather the selected U-boats into staging areas off the northwest Irish coast, tow them out to designated deepwater disposal zones, and sink them. either by gunfire, explosive charges, or letting them founder after disabling. On paper, the plan was tidy. In practice, it was a nightmare of weather, mechanical failure, and maritime unpredictability. Towing aging, partially sabotaged submarines through rough winter seas is not simple. Many U-boats were hardly seaworthy for even a short tow. Tugs strained and took on the responsibility of moving hulks that had been baked by salt and stress. Storms made the sea a writhing machine, and more than a few submarines broke tow lines, suffered structural failures, or simply sank before reaching the scuttling areas. Cold water corrosion and prior battle damage made hulls brittle. The threat of explosive charges detonating prematurely or misfiring made the operation hazardous for the crews involved in sinking them. Despite the hazards, the scale was immense. Dozens upon dozens of boats were assembled for towing, guarded by destroyers and smaller craft to ensure that no dramatic last-minute theft or sabotage occurred. Where a periscope once signaled a night ambush, now an Allied sailor would mark a coordinate on a clipboard and note the depth where a hulking German submarine would finally be left to rest. The purpose was not salvage, but eradication, the deliberate wiping of a threatened class of weaponry from active theaters. The actual sinking methods varied. Some boats were scuttled by opening sea valves or setting charges aboard. Others were placed out of reach in deep trenches and dispatched by naval gunfire. Because many were in poor condition, the most reliable method sometimes meant parking them in positions where the weather would do the final work, letting powerful North Atlantic swells collapse weakened structures and drag them under. Stories from these tows contain images of creaking steel, men shivering in rain, and the slow, inevitable finality as an emaciated hull slid beneath a gray horizon. Operation Deadlight was not, however, total. A number of U-boats were spared for technical evaluation. High-priority boats, especially those showing advanced technology or in better structural condition, were set aside and allocated to the navies or research laboratories of the victorious powers. These select submarines would be unpacked in cold bays and dry docks, the inner workings examined with surgical precision, battery arrays measured, hull forms sketched, snorkel arrangements documented. Engineers took apart propulsion systems, torpedo launching mechanisms, and periscope components, trying to discern what could be borrowed, improved, or avoided. The decision to destroy the majority of the fleet was not universally praised. Some naval minds argued that preservation or sale might have served reconstruction or commercial ends, while others worried about the lost opportunity of retaining a larger pool of material for longer-term study. But in the immediate post-war context, costly, chaotic, and still uncertain, Operation Deadlight represented a pragmatic closure. It erased at scale the palpable physical presence of the U-boat threat. And it left behind an ocean filled with the ghostly silhouettes of what had once been a lethal armada. The finality of Deadlight did not mean the story of German undersea technology ended. On the contrary, the handful of boats salvaged for study would cast long shadows over submarine design for decades. But for most of the surrendered hulls, the sea became a graveyard. Metal, footage, and men's histories settling into cold depths. The decision to sink so many vessels was as much a political act as an operational one, a symbolic closing of a chapter and the physical denial of a powerful weapon to any future aggressor. Deadlight's legacy is paradoxical. It removed the immediate threat while creating an underwater archive of war. Those wrecks would, decades later, be sought by archaeologists and divers. Their steel whispers would offer evidence for those with patience to listen about the last days of a lethal fleet. The aftermath of the scuttlings and internments unfolded into a quieter, less dramatic theater. Laboratories, dry docks, and naval yards where technicians and scientists dissected what had once been instruments of stealth and death. The Allies set about a process that would shape the course of submarine design for the Cold War, learning from German expertise, incorporating useful innovations, and allocating the spoils of war among powers that were already eyeing each other with fresh suspicion. A tripartite commission organized the formal distribution of captured vessels and technology. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union each received boats for examination under official arrangements, while smaller Allied nations took what they could for training and limited operational use. The allocation was strategic, an attempt to balance immediate military curiosity against the geopolitical reality that today's partner could be tomorrow's rival. What the engineers discovered in these boats was often startling. The Type 21 series especially appeared to be a blueprint for the future. Hull lines optimized for submerged running, larger battery capacity giving sustained underwater speed, and improved hydrodynamic shapes that reduced noise and increased efficiency. In mechanical terms, the Germans had moved away from designs that treated submersion as temporary and surface cruising as central. Instead, they built for a new paradigm, craft that intended to fight largely under the waves. Those designs, when parsed and adapted, would influence submarine construction well into the 1950s and beyond. Western navies took the lessons into workshops and shipyards. British and American naval architects reverse-engineered systems, adapting elements to their own production practices. Hull shapes, battery technology, snorkel systems, and quieter propulsion ideas filtered into experimental classes and later into mainstream designs. For the United States Navy, the war's end became an intensive study period. Captured components were reassembled, test dives were conducted, and crews were trained on systems they had never experienced at scale during the war. Similarly, the Royal Navy retained and tested several boats, using them as instructional and developmental platforms. The Soviet Union, for its part, absorbed German ideas with equal determination. Soviet engineers studied hull forms and snorkel systems, integrating aspects into the Soviet submarine development pipeline. These acquisitions provided a technological shortcut that accelerated the Soviets' conventional submarine progress in the immediate post-war years. The redistribution of German submarine technology thus helped sow the seeds of a new naval rivalry. Knowledge that had been once concentrated in one power was now distributed among many. Not all transfers were high-level and pristine. Many boats that made it into other navies were cannibalized for parts or used as targets and training hulks. Smaller Allied navies, Norway, France, and Canada among them, received a handful of submarines for training, evaluation, and acoustic tests. Some boats continued to serve in foreign fleets for several years after the war, reconditioned and repainted under new flags. They became pragmatic tools to help rebuild shattered navies, to teach sonar operators, and to provide live platforms for developing anti-submarine tactics. Some submarines achieved a second life as technical test beds. A U-boat opened in dock could reveal battery placement, internal ventilation, compartmentalization, and the German approach to torpedo stowage. Naval inventors and naval schools took notes. In certain cases, the Germans' experiments with hull contours informed new Western thinking about submerged efficiency, an idea that would become crucial once nuclear propulsion removed the surface cruising constraint entirely. Alongside the technical transfers, there were episodes of peculiar and sometimes dramatic salvage. A few wartime prizes became museum pieces or national relics. The U-505, captured by the U.S. Navy in 1944, was preserved and became a unique American symbol of naval prize-taking. Eventually, after the war, it found a permanent home in a museum where visitors could step into its cramped corridors and imagine what life had been like aboard. Other boats, once languishing under a tarp or left broken in docks, were lifted and pieced into museums across Europe. These preserved vessels became educational tools, reminders of the submerged war and its costs. There were also high-profile bureaucratic decisions that shaped long-term outcomes. Domes. The Allies negotiated not just ship distribution, but the custody of German naval personnel and technicians, many of whom possessed the intimate knowledge that could accelerate submarine research. Some German engineers were recruited into foreign research programs. Others were detained or dispersed. That transfer of human capital was as important as the transfer of hardware. Skilled technicians taught Allied workers about construction tolerances, welding techniques, and the subtleties of electric motor maintenance. In some cases, these same technicians later worked in shipyards outside Germany, contributing directly to post-war naval programs. But the sharing of wartime secrets was not a pure exchange. It was competitive and often secretive. Each major power guarded aspects of what it learned. Reports circulated in closed channels. Some captured submarines were secretly stripped in nighttime operations so that particular technologies could be examined away from prying eyes. Even among wartime allies, there was a sense that technological advantage would be a new currency of power. The material legacies of the U-boat transfers were visible in training programs, in blueprints being redrawn in naval yards, and in the gradual shift of submarine doctrine. The emphasis moved from short-sprint surface attacks to sustained undersea operations. New classes of post-war submarines reflected this paradigm shift, and many naval tacticians credited the captured German designs with creating an intellectual leap. What had been a dark tactical tool in the hands of a losing navy had become, paradoxically, a formative textbook for peacetime navies around the world. By the end of the decade, many of the actual German boats were gone, scuttled, scrapped, or sunk as targets, but their influence had been redistributed in ways that would shape the submarine race to come. The physical presence of German submarines became less important than the lessons they left behind. Designs, engineering tricks, and the memory of a fierce all-undersea struggle that had changed naval warfare forever. When the guns fell silent and the bureaucrats signed the papers, the final chapter of many German submarines. Marines was left to the sea, but the ocean keeps records in its own way. The rusted remains, the cold black silhouettes on sonar screens, became an archaeological archive. Decades after their sinking, offshore surveys, diving expeditions, and a new generation of undersea archaeologists began to map and study the dispersed graveyard. The hulls that were scuttled or left to founder off the Irish coast and in northern fjords lay like sentences in a sentence, silent, intact enough to tell stories, and full of evidence. In the early 21st century, renewed interest in those wrecks led to targeted searches. Marine archaeologists used side-scan sonar, remote-operated vehicles, and deep-sea photography to locate and document the resting places of U-boats. Teams cataloged hull conditions, damage patterns, and site contexts, assembling a picture of how the fleet had been reduced from active weapons to oceanic relics. Those finds did more than satisfy curiosity. They offered concrete data. Corrosion patterns told experts about how the boats had been prepared, or not, before sinking. Evidence of explosive charges or gunfire confirmed how particular boats had been dispatched. For historians and salvage teams, the sea yielded undeniable forensic proof of the final days of an industry of war. Museums around the Atlantic took a different route. Several recovered or preserved submarines became public exhibits, opening a portal into the claustrophobic world of the U-boat crew. These vessels offer visitors a visceral sense of scale. Narrow bunks, cramped mess tables, a periscope that must be operated by a single hand, and control rooms filled with valves and dials. The public response to these museum ships has often been a mix of fascination and solemn reflection. For many visitors, stepping down into a preserved U-boat is to step into the human geography of conflict, where young men lived, fought, and sometimes died within inches of each other. Some of the most dramatic salvages produced boats that traveled far from their original theaters to become icons in foreign ports. These exhibits serve an important function, turning once secret machines into public history. Artifacts that inform discussion about technological change, wartime choices, and the human cost of naval campaigns. The museum U-boat becomes a text for education, a way to teach sonar operators, to train new generations in naval history, and to remind civilians how modern warfare often hides itself in small, metal spaces. The legacy of the post-war handling of U-boats also had geopolitical roots. The redistribution of U-boat technology became part of a larger narrative about how World War II's end bled into the Cold War's start. In short order, lessons learned from German submarine science were integrated into new defense programs. Once secret details found their way into Western and Eastern design bureaus alike. The story of German technology did not remain wholly German. Instead, it became a shared, sometimes contested inheritance. That legacy reshaped navies. Submarines became faster, quieter, and more resilient in the next generation, and the concepts proved foundational as navies worldwide transitioned toward nuclear propulsion and the submarine's new strategic roles. Culturally, the fate of the U-boats has slid between two poles. On one hand, the wrecks and museums are grim monuments to technological ingenuity used for violence. On the other hand, they are objects of technical admiration, examples of engineering under extreme constraint. Public memory of the U-boat campaign is thus complicated, part horror, part curiosity, part admiration for a clever design. For veterans and descendants, these boats are also grave sites, memorials to the human costs. In practical terms, the ocean graveyards left behind by Operation Deadlight and the many other scuttlings are now heritage sites. Researchers and local communities sometimes collaborate to preserve what can be preserved and to mark what should be remembered. Those submerged remains are also environmental concerns. Old fuel stores, batteries, and ordnance can present hazards that require careful management. Many nations now treat wartime wrecks as both historical resources and liabilities, requiring protection and, in some cases, remediation. Looking back on the arc from 1945 to the present, the story of the U-boats offers several ironies and lessons. A weapon designed for stealth and annihilation ended up bequeathing technical blueprints to the victors. A fleet that once dominated the headlines and the headlines' nightmares now rests silently in the depths, its physical presence often gone, but its technical ideas scattered across shipyards and classrooms the world over. The men who served in those boats, on all sides, left intimate diaries, logbooks, and memories that humanize a conflict that otherwise can be told only in tonnage and statistics. For viewers who stand on modern piers and watch freighters move across a calm sea, the presence of those dead submarines can be easy to miss. But the legacy of the U-boat campaign is not hidden to those who look. It informs naval doctrine, material design, and the moral conversation about the uses of technology. The scattered hulls have become part of a long memory, a maritime archive that continues to attract historians, divers, and everyday citizens. If you come away with one thought, it should be this: war's instruments rarely disappear without leaving traces. Whether raised and studied in dry docks, sunk as targets in the North Atlantic, or preserved behind glass in museums, the German U-boats of World War II linger in our seas and in our imagination. They are artifacts of an era when undersea warfare became decisive and anonymous in equal measure. They are reminders, too, that the end of conflict is never only a single day of surrender. It is a long process of disposal, of reinterpretation, and of memory-making. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories about what happened to the machines of war after the fighting stopped, tanks, planes, and other relics, hit subscribe and the bell. We'll keep telling the untold histories that surfaced after the guns were silenced.